Ken Carson is a name that you've undoubtedly heard many times before if you have any interest in underground rap or even hip-hop as a whole, with him serving as a prominent face and avatar for the new wave of rap that began to emerge post-2020. But just like his other Opium brothers, there's still many mysteries circulating around Ken and his career, with him seemingly breaking into the scene out of nowhere sometime around 2021. But this rapid rise to fame and immediate connection to high-profile artists in the game isn't exactly what you would think, because it turns out that Ken has actually been building those relationships long before he even picked up the mic. And what do I mean by that exactly? Well, I'll tell you when we look into the story of Ken Carson. Kenyatta Lee Frazier Jr. was born April 11, 2000 in Atlanta, Georgia, a well-known mecca for hip-hop with many acts coming out of there during the SoundCloud scene, including the Migos, Lil Yachty, and of course, Playboi Carti, which gave Ken an advantage early on in his career because when you think about it, being born in a place like Atlanta or LA or New York where there's already a bunch of people who are making music and high-profile artists that came out of there, it's not too hard to make your way into the scene, make big-time connections, and maybe meet the right person that can introduce you to the industry, which Ken would eventually do. But before we even touch on that, we got to talk about his childhood, which was slightly more eventful than most kids, with Ken of course being a fan of video games, anime, fashion, soccer, and most importantly comic books, which Ken was heavily inspired by, with X-Men being his favorite comic of all time, even using it as inspiration for the names of a couple of his albums later on in his career. But of course, being a rapper later on in life meant that he would also listen to a lot of hip-hop as a kid, with his mother introducing him to artists like Soulja Boy and Lil Wayne, some of the most influential artists in the early internet age, as well as Future, because if you come from Atlanta, you absolutely have to listen to Future. He's bigger than Drake over there. But unlike a lot of his peers, Ken didn't immediately want to become a rapper. In fact, he didn't know what he wanted to do with life because he was actually a pretty confused and troubled kid who had a lot of negative thoughts and was prone to fits of anger, including one when he was at the age of 10 where he actually ended up slapping his teacher. It was because of this event and others like it that Ken was eventually full-on expelled and sent to military school to finish off the rest of his education. But luckily for him, before he was sent away, he was able to form a pretty important connection with somebody in the industry that would change his life forever. This all went down when Ken was talking on the phone to one of his friends while watching an 808 Mafia video, and she just so happened to be hanging out with the producer known as Lil 88, TM88's nephew or possible cousin. I've heard both, but I think it's his nephew. But either way, TM88 is a pretty prolific producer who's part of 808 Mafia alongside Southside, as well as being the producer who actually created the beat for EXO Tour Life. So already that's pretty legendary status, and Ken was able to connect to him at only the age of 13. And after Ken got to talk to TM88 face to face, he would immediately ask him if he could go to the studio with him and see what that rapper lifestyle was really like. And honestly, it shows that Ken had a lot of balls at the time, because unlike other kids who probably would have got scared after facing their hero and not know what to say, he immediately asked if he could go to the studio, and because of that, he was able to form a lot of connections. Because after going to that first studio session and getting to know Southside, they immediately formed a connection, and after that, Ken basically showed up to every studio session that they would do, getting to know artists like Travis Scott, Young Thug, and most importantly, Playboi Carti. Now this was way back in the day before Playboi Carti ever put out a mixtape. He was still running with Splur Gang at the time, but either way, getting to know him so early on meant that Playboi would remember Ken in the future, and because of that, their connection would eventually grow. And I know a lot of people are probably saying right now, this entire story sounds way too good to be true. There's no way that you're watching an 808 Mafia video and just so happen to meet somebody from that actual group, ask them to go to the studio, and then immediately you're connected like that. But after talking to Lil Xan about his come up and how he just so happened to be sitting in a trap house somewhere with a bunch of guys in a garage with a computer that barely worked, and just like that, Stat Quo and Tyler Yahweh ended up walking in and immediately he got a manager, and that all happened because he's in California, and the same thing can happen if you're in a mecca like Atlanta. I mean, after all, there's a reason why people move to these places. I mean, Jack Harlow basically didn't have any buzz going for him whatsoever, but after he landed in Atlanta, he immediately formed up connections and overnight became famous. And Ken just so happened to be lucky enough that he was able to do that at a very young age. So in my opinion, this story does check out, and I wouldn't immediately consider him an industry plant, but let's keep going through his story and see if there's any other possible signs that he could be one. And on top of that, with Ken being so opportunistic, he's actually the perfect disciple of Playboi Carti, because in Carti's early career, he did the exact same thing by connecting to A$AP Rocky before then cutting his friends off. I mean, Ken didn't do anything like that, but either way, they seem to be two peas from the same pot. But even with all these great opportunities and big connections forming up, it wasn't long long before Ken had to get shipped off to military school, where he basically had nothing to do, spending most of his days thinking about life and FaceTiming girls on the phone that he just so happened to sneak in. And it was because of this phone that he would eventually get caught and then kicked out of military school as well. So at this point, you think that Ken is going to be somebody who never finishes their education. He's probably never going to be able to get a job or any opportunities, but luckily he's a little bit smarter than he looks because he actually ended up getting his GED. And because he decided to go down that path, he actually ended up graduating before most of his peers. But I mean, look at Ken and his personality type. There's absolutely no way that he's going to live a normal life working a 9 to 5, and he had to do something more creative if he was ever going to be fulfilled. So at this point, you're probably thinking there's only one career path that Ken could possibly take, and that's exactly right. He started an Instagram called Playboi Carti and started posting fit pics. Yeah, probably not what you were expecting, but after that completely failed, he finally decided to pick up the mic and start rapping himself, creating what many consider to be his first ever song, 32, dropping it on SoundCloud. However, there's no way to know for sure if this is actually his first song because his entire SoundCloud account actually got deleted a couple years later by an angry ex-girlfriend that he cheated on. And the only reason that we know that this song existed in the first place is because somebody actually wrote a small article about the song talking about Ken Carson being an upcoming rapper in Atlanta. It really isn't anything too special, but considering it was so early on in his career, it's actually pretty impressive. But that was really only a taste of what was to come for Ken's career, because soon after that, he ended up attending a Playboi Carti concert in LA, where he ended up getting into a fight with another concert goer and then eventually got kicked out. But luckily for Ken, Carti would see this all going down and just so happened to actually remember Ken from those studio sessions back in the day, giving him a backstage wristband and letting him back into the show, where the two's connection was officially cemented. Some people speculate that Carti was actually puppeteering Ken's entire career from this point forward, although I don't really believe that. I think it's a little bit too early on to say, considering that Ken would go on to work in the underground for a couple more years before joining Opium. But it is notable that Ken's original SoundCloud would be taken down a couple months after this show, with a lot of people thinking that the ex-girlfriend angle is actually a cover-up story, and the only reason that it was taken down is because he wanted to start fresh with a new sound. But whether or not Carti and Ken actually formed a business connection that day or not, it's needless to say that Ken was still a massive fan of Carti, with Carti dropping his self-titled album the following year, and Ken going on to tweet out that it's the most inspirational album of all time, which is A1 dick sucking in my opinion. I think Carti would be proud. But for now, Ken was mostly on his own, going to local Atlanta studios to record music, dropping it on SoundCloud, and eventually forming a connection to another pretty big young artist known as Doo-Wop Kane. Does anyone remember Doo-Wop Kane? He was a pretty big deal from around 2016 to 2017, but nowadays I feel like absolutely nobody talks about him anymore. But that connection goes to show that Ken did have some sort of organic growth in the underground and wasn't immediately zipped up into the mainstream overnight. He did put the work in, and even though he did have those big connections to people like Carti, they weren't immediately helping him out. And through the rest of 2016 and 2017, that's what Ken would do. Stay on the grind, keep making music, try to form more connections with small-time artists, and gain a little bit of a fan base. And all this was started to pay off by 2018 when Ken got a co-sign from a pretty big artist named Made in Tokyo, who's a former XXL freshman member as well as a heavily slept-on artist by today's standards, but in 2018, he was on top of the world. And off of the momentum of that co-sign, he would start to tease his first ever mixtape called Boy Barbie, which was meant to be released in late 2018 before later being moved back to early 2019. But when the time came for the mixtape to release in February 2019, he would instead only put out the cover art and track list before then moving the release date back again. And instead of putting out the mixtape, he would instead release a single called Fold on the YouTube channel called V-Files, which is basically an Atlanta version of a Trill Funk or Elevator, which helped to put on artists early on in their career like Lil Uzi Vert, Lil Yachty, and even Playboi Carti himself, with Ken's track going on to gain 32,000 views on the channel, which definitely isn't too bad. I mean, I feel like I would be pretty impressed if I got that amount of views so early on in my career, but at the same time, it definitely didn't blow him up or anything. As the year went on, he moved the project back time and time again before finally releasing it in May of 2019 with a completely different track list than the one he originally showed off, although it did have a pretty big time feature on it from the likes of Lil Yachty. So at this point, Ken was definitely making waves in the underground scene and building his fan base day by day, with him immediately dropping a follow-up project called Teen X, Works, which was also a pretty big hit with fans. But this is really only the beginning of Ken's career, because soon after that, he became a full-on member of Carti's entourage and began to be pictured alongside him everywhere that he went. But little did fans know that Ken and Carti were actually cooking up something bigger than fans could ever have expected. A brand new label named Opium, and one of the most disappointing Christmas gifts of all time, Carti's next album, Whole Lotta Red. Or at least that's what people were originally calling it when it dropped in 2020, but this album's reception has changed more than probably any other project ever, with people now calling it one of the greatest projects to ever drop and the birth of the entire rage sound that would take over the world in 2021. Which I definitely don't agree with, but whether or not you have the opinion that it's the greatest project of all time or a complete piece of dog shit like some people think, you can't debate that Ken Carson definitely had a pretty big hand at making this project into what it was, with Ken even producing one of the tracks off this project alongside Little 88, known as Bueno. And this is a massive deal for somebody who's so underground, because the track list of this album includes artists like Kanye West, Kid Cudi, and Future, some of the biggest legends to ever come out of the rap game. And yes, you heard me correctly, Kanye is a legend. I don't want to hear any arguments, I don't care. And even with this project getting a lot of initial backlash, Ken had officially positioned himself in the right spot to take over the following decade, with reception for the album slowly changing in the following years, as well as the rise of rage music coming to prominence in 2021, which meant that the world was finally ready for Carti's new artist-run label known as Opium, with Ken Carson headlining the entire lineup. In fact, he was basically the only one on the lineup. In fact, for a time during 2020, Ken basically was the lineup. There was a couple other artists that were supposed to sign on, like Lil Hunky, but for one reason or another, it never ended up happening, which probably was an overall positive for Ken, because it meant that he would get the most attention from the label, get all of the rollout, and basically be the star. And as soon as the year started off, Ken would go to work dropping multiple projects, including Lost Files, Teen X Relapse, the deluxe version of his original Teen X project, which also included 2 music videos for his tracks High as Shit and Butterfly, which now both sit just a little bit under 1 million views, which is definitely a very big step up from 32K on his previous music video, so Ken was definitely making big moves. After that, we would get Lost Files 2, which Ken considered mostly throwaway songs, but despite that, fans were eating it up and couldn't wait for more. And this project also included his first ever TikTok hit called Teen Bean, which of course went on to blow up on the platform and propel his career to all new heights. And that big hit was followed up by his debut studio album known as Project X, where he would officially go from being Teen X to now being the X-Man. And yeah, that's right, I told you X-Men would come back into the story a little bit later on, and here they are. And this is the first project that really cemented Ken with his cult fan base, with fans eating up absolutely everything that he put out and couldn't wait for more, saying that he wasn't dropping frequently enough, which is kind of crazy to think about considering he's already put out 3 projects in a couple months. Soon after that, Ken would then do his first ever interview on Our Generation Music, followed up by a new member of Opium joining the label known as Destroy Lonely. And it turns out that Ken and Lonely had actually been friends for quite a while, and it was only because Ken recommended Lonely to Carti that he would accept him into Opium, becoming the 3rd member. There's also Homicide Gang, but nobody ever talks about them, but thought it was worth a mention nonetheless. And while this was all going on, Trippie Redd would also drop his Trip at Night album, adding a lot of fuel to the fire that was the rage wave at the time, as well as So Fago gaining massive buzz for his track Knock Knock getting a music video on Lyrical Lemonade. And all of this combined would make rage the most popular music genre of 2021. And luckily for Ken, he had already been making this type of music for such a long time that it wasn't that hard for him to continue to do so and add a new spin on it, taking elements from hyperpop to make his own sound. And in a perfect turn of events for Ken, So Fago made one of the biggest fumbles of all time, completely destroying his career and leaving the path open for Ken to take over and become the biggest artist in that lane. Now, before we move on, I do want to briefly mention the back and forth that some fans have about whether or not Ken or Fago is the father of rage, with some saying that Ken technically started the wave off in 2020 with his Teen X project, which does make sense because this project definitely does sound more like that rage style than Boy Barbie does, and it also predates Fago's album After Me, which many consider his first real rage album, so it's definitely fair to say that Ken may have actually pioneered the genre. But honestly, it comes down to that whole Cyber and Zillakami comparison, where Cyber definitely came first, but Zillakami is the one who made that style of music popular, so most people remember him over Cyber. It's the same for So Fago and Ken Carson. It comes down to the argument, is it more important who created that style of music first, or is it more important who made it popular and actually ran off with it? Well, it's up for you to decide, as long as we can all agree that Whole Lotta Red is definitely not a rage album, and Trippie Redd basically bit all these guys. Can we all agree on that? Yeah? Okay. Anyways, after those couple projects dropped, Ken Ken would then perform at Summer Smash, his first real big performance in front of a massive crowd. He did do one digital concert during 2020, but I wouldn't really count that. He also managed to land an interview on Montreality, which is honestly just really nice to see that channel's still going so strong in 2021 and is still managing to get big time artists even to this day. It's not like No Jumper where they completely fell off the map after 2019. And the very same month that Ken ended up doing that interview on Montreality, he would also be an opener alongside Destroy Lonely for Carti's big comeback tour after COVID named Narcissist. And if you're wondering where the name of that tour came from, it actually came from an argument that Playboi Carti had with his baby mother, Iggy Azalea, where she would call him a narcissist, so he decided to name his entire tour after it. Yeah, Playboi Carti is a very interesting guy, I gotta say. That tour would continue through the end of 2021 to 2022, and then when Ken got back, he would drop his next mixtape, Lost Files No. 3, followed up by an appearance on Icebox alongside Destroy Lonely. And if that wasn't enough to do in a couple months, immediately after that, he would once again head on his own tour alongside Destroy Lonely called the X-Men Tour, which undoubtedly made the two of them a whole lot richer. And it would also prove to the world that both Destroy Lonely and Ken Carson had enough clout that they would be able to headline their own tour independent of Playboi Carti, so that's a pretty big move if you think about it. And immediately after wrapping up that tour, Ken would then drop a deluxe version for Lost Files called Lost Files 3.5, before then following that up by his sophomore studio album named X that was actually co-produced by Playboi Carti. And honestly, it's crazy to see a label actually let its artist drop music. So many times I've seen artists blow up, make one album, and then for one reason or another they get shelved, but it goes to show that sometimes artist-run labels can actually help you out, and in this case, Ken is definitely winning. Just make sure to never sign to Gucci Mane or you might end up like Lil Wop. Anyways, and not too long after X came out, he would then do a deluxe of that album called Extend It, which included one song called Freestyle 2, which got so much hype online, he actually ended up doing a Genius interview for the track. With him finally ending off 2022 by performing at Rolling Loud, finally closing off the year as his most successful one to date, as well as Opium now being one of the biggest brands in music. And if you think he's going to fall off anytime soon, well, let me tell you, 2023 was an even bigger year for him and possibly his biggest year of all time. With him starting off the year by dropping Lost Files No. 4, before then starting the rollout for his third official studio album with Opium, known as A Great Chaos, which would become his biggest album to date. With the lead single off this project, Jennifer's Body, going on to take over TikTok in an even bigger way than any of Ken's previous works, and the project itself going on to sell 50K first week, which is extremely impressive by today's standards. And right after the success of that project, Ken would once again catch the attention of the internet by hanging out with Lil Uzi Vert and supposedly creating a track alongside him that also has Destroy Lonely on it, although it hasn't dropped yet. But even with that song not coming out yet, the biggest thing to go down between Uzi and Ken is Ken actually producing a track off of Uzi's Pink tape called Times 2, and once again, this album didn't have very good reception, and as the years go on, honestly, I don't think the reception is changing all that much. But hey, even if the album doesn't do that well, Ken still gets paid, he gets the co-sign from Uzi, and immediately after that, he once again went on tour with Playboi Carti, before finally finishing off the year by dropping a music video for his track Fighting My Demons on Lyrical Lemonade, which honestly seems really overdue for Ken, but either way, it's good to see him on there, and of course, the video did absolutely amazing. And that basically brings us up to 2024, a year that probably hasn't been as big as 2023 for Ken, maybe not even as big as 2022, but still, he's maintaining his relevancy, he's still dropping music, and he's still gaining new fans. The highlights of this year is him dropping a deluxe version of Great Chaos, getting an interview with Nardwuar, and of course, getting shit on by Anthony Fantano, filling out all the boxes for a modern underground rapper. I'm gonna be honest with you though, I don't even really consider Ken Carson an underground rapper anymore, because he's almost on the level of some of the big boys in the industry, even though he doesn't have the years behind him. I mean, how many other artists can sell out venues all over the country, sell 50K first week every time they drop an album, do millions of views on every single music video they drop, and have an insanely strong cult fan base the same way that Ken does? I feel like the only reason that people still consider him underground is because he's kind of in the shadow of Playboi Carti, being seen as a sidekick or just another character on his roster, but at the same time, I definitely think that Ken can stand on his own 2 feet. I mean, Carti is definitely one of the biggest artists in the world, but he only drops every 3 or so years, so if you're really looking for somebody that drops that same style of music but a lot more frequently, well, you can look to Ken Carson. And even somebody like me me, who was a big hater of the new underground scene and found it very corny, can at least respect the artistry that Ken Carson is putting out. I mean, his fans are definitely interesting, but that's not really his fault, and I wouldn't blame him for that. And honestly, at this point, I couldn't see him going away because he has so much clout and is so known in the broader rap game, but also has such devoted fans that I really couldn't see a fall off coming anytime soon. But with all that said, that only leaves us with one more question. Did he really earn it? I mean, a lot of people would probably consider him an industry plant or somebody who clung to bigger artists to try to get his fame up, but at the same time, that's basically what everybody does. Because even if you do blow up on your own, it's not long before you sign to a label and they start trying to put you around somebody more popular to try to make you look bigger by association. I mean, they did it with Smoke Perp, they did it with Lil Xan with all the crazy features that he got on his Total Xanarchy album, even Lil Pump had a feature with Lil Wayne. I mean, I don't really know how you can gauge organic growth anymore in the underground with so much botting, associations with other people, and just overall illegitimate means of getting to the top. But is Kem one of those people? Well, I'm not really sure. I'm going to leave that up to you to decide and find out in the comments below. And next time, we're probably going to cover his Opium brother and twin, Destroy Lonely. And let me tell you, this guy is a little bit more controversial. So stick around for that one, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you then. Peace.